our beer in because it was local, and then people from all over the country and all over the world would hear about it and see it here. If you go into a typical grocery store in the United States today and compare it to what it would have looked like in 1960, which is 40 years ago, 1965, it's just stunning. We have more variety of bread, for example, wonderful bread, than any place in the world. We have more variety of beer than any place in the world. We have more variety of wine. A friend of mine once said, you know, in Italy they eat Italian food. And we take that for granted. We go to Italy because the food's so good. But in America, we eat all kinds of food. And we have German beer and Czech beer and English beer, and we have beer from all over the world. Plus, we have our own beers with all these different styles. There's no American way that you have to make beer. We can make beer any way we want.
When I opened Union Square Cafe in 1985, I knew I'd have beer at the bar. I was starting to see beer a little bit in fine dining restaurants, but not too much. So we had 3 taps. We served about 5 or 6 by the bottle at that point, which was a lot, I think. You would actually have people feel a little bit funny at first. This is 20 years ago now, about asking to have a beer because it looked funny to have the bottle on the table. And then over the course of the, the crafted beers, the microbrew beers, it became chic all of a sudden. And there was no more embarrassment about having a glass of beer or a pint of beer on the table. And our beer sales really, really started to take off. It was no longer acceptable just to have one specialty kind of beer, plus a light, plus a Pilsner. But now you really wanted to show your stuff by having a handful from Belgium, a handful from California, some from Maine, some from upstate New York, and it's really just taken off from there. There's another thing that's starting to happen across America right now that certainly wasn't happening a long time ago, where chefs and restaurateurs are asking breweries and brewmasters to craft a beer specifically for that restaurant. We did that when we opened Blue Smoke. We knew exactly what our barbecue sauce would taste like, as well as the spice rub for the ribs and for the pulled pork. And we gave that sauce and that special magic dust to a brewery and said, please come up with a beer that's going to work with this flavor profile. And that became Blue Smoke Original Ale. And against 39 other beers on our list, that outsells all of them by at least 5 to 1.
I often like people to taste the beverage first, just to kind of introduce that to their mouth. But that's what I'm used to in wine tasting.
First, what we're going to do with the beer is get it around the glass a little bit. I want you to swirl. I want you to get your nose in there. This is what I call a cheese war. We have wine versus beer with cheese in front of an audience, and it's almost like Iron Chef, but it's Iron Sommelier.
My strategy is to show why I think wine is as versatile, if not more versatile, than beer with cheese.
People think of wine as the perfect accompaniment for cheese. I think that beer actually does a better job.
I think my strategy is to really kind of jump out of the box with something unusual, a wine that's unusual, a wine that's kind of not expected. It's a frizzante wine. It's a low-alcohol frizzante wine. This is one of the wines I call my breakfast wines. I love these wines for brunches. I think they're great. Beer, I think, can absolutely refresh the palate.
This style of beer is a style of farmhouse ale, and I think this is one area where beer has it over most wines, is carbonation. Carbonation lifts strong flavors from your palate. It cuts through fat, scrubbing bubbles. Literally scrub it off your tongue. My other feeling is that while wine is pretty good at doing contrast with cheeses, beer is better at doing harmony. The beer becomes the beer version of the cheese, and the cheese becomes the cheese version of the beer. Still with me?
I love the texture of the beer with the cheese, but they do become one to me. And this is, again, why I love wine, particularly this wine with cheese, because one just kind of balances out the other, you know? And so I think it's a handshake versus a big old hug.
I think that the handshake versus the embrace was a good way of putting it. It's a good handshake, but it is more contrast versus the harmony. So it really kind of depends on, are you in a contrast mood, a little bit standoffish, maybe just a handshake, or are you in the mood for the hug?
So I think it's interesting. Again, it's about the experience you want to have, not necessarily is one better than the other.
I'm kind of into the hug. Well, if you've got a steak, you think about it, say you decide to have a glass of Cabernet with a steak. That's essentially like a fruit sauce against what is a caramelized piece of what is hopefully really good meat. When you have a brown ale with that, you're bringing caramelized flavors, some chocolatey flavors that specifically link up with the flavors on the surface of that steak. They taste a little bit the same, and it's that harmony that really brings you some of the best matches that you can get.
As brewers, we have taste profiles. One can have a grassy taste, a lemony taste. This is in the beer, and one can eventually work out which beer characteristics would most suit the sort of food that one is talking about.
If you love coffee, if you love espresso or chocolate, if you love citrus, if you love Chardonnay, if you love champagne, there's a beer that has those characteristics and more.
Several types of dark beer that are sweet rather than roasty will go wonderfully well with anything that contains chocolate, especially very bitter chocolate, very black, dark chocolate. I'm a bit of a chocoholic, so I just love that.
I can't wait to see the look on your guys' faces when you smell this beer. The beer is actually smoked. So here we have a beer that smells faintly of of smoked sausages. So it has something else going on. Those of you who may be familiar with the German-style Weiss beer or Weizen beer, made half from wheat and half from barley. Also fermented with a special yeast strain, which gives you aromas of bananas, cloves, bubble gum, and sometimes a little bit of smoke. Now, when you first smell it, you say, okay, that's pretty weird. But in fact, when you get it together with food, let me tell you, if you got bacon and eggs, oh boy. You got pork, brilliant. So you can really bring this to bear with barbecue and all sorts of things. And I think that this is just the thing to go with a smoked cheese. You get around the glass, you're not going to miss the smoke.
Wow.
Some people will say, well, I don't drink beer. I just drink wine. That's kind of like saying, I'm going to write a symphony, and I'm going to use half the instruments and half the notes. There are a lot more instruments and a lot more notes than most people realize.
Beer and wine are products of equal nobility, equal complexity, equal history. There is no need for beer to take second place, and you're not being pretentious if you say, this is a great beer, I really love it.
What do you guys think, wine or beer?
The wines were great, but I think a lot of the beers really accented the cheese well, and most people would never think to do it because it's just never talked about.
I was very skeptical with the idea of pairing cheese with beer. But two of the beers tonight were like off the charts. I've never had anything like them. They were amazing with the cheese. I was very impressed.
Let's see, who likes the wine better? And let's see hands for beer.
Converts.
It's wine people who really show up for this a lot of the time. So you see people have their minds change totally right before their own eyes, and they can't believe that it's even happened. You see wine people show up and they say, I can't believe I voted for the beer.
It's tough to get people to drink beer when they're just thinking, if I'm dining or fine dining, it's wine. And if I'm at a picnic or I'm at the ballpark, I'm going to have beer. And I think a lot of people, there's a lot of room in the middle to kind of meet and have a dialogue with people to let them understand that there are beers that are absolutely exquisite, and I would serve them at the finest restaurant.